Hi everyone, let's take a look at exercise 13-1, which deals with characteristics of corporations. In this exercise, we're asked to describe how each of the following characteristics of organizations apply to corporations. So the first one is owner, authority, and control. And how does that apply to corporations? Well, it really is the idea that there is one vote per share. So if you own the majority of shares in a corporation, then you have an influence of control over the corporation. If the corporation is widely held, you may be even to have control if you own as little as 5 or 6%. That would be a very widely held corporation, of course. Number 2, the second characteristic is called ease of formation. Now, with corporations, regarding formation, it requires government approval. Okay, so although corporations aren't exactly the hardest thing to set up, they certainly are a bit more difficult, require a few more steps than setting up a sole proprietorship or some other forms of organizations as well. Now let's talk about for a minute the transferability of ownership. Okay? There's a real advantage here with corporations in that it's readily transferable. What that means, why don't I say readily transferred? And what that means is through the buying and selling of the shares of stock, it is very easy to transfer ownership from one party to another. Now, number 4 talks about the ability to raise large capital amounts. And the corporation perhaps is best for that, so what we can say is there is a high ability to raise large capital amounts, okay? Or we could instead just simply say there's a high ability, okay? Now, let's talk about the duration of life of a corporation, and simply one word describes this. It's unlimited. Corporations do not live and die with those that set up the corporations. They have an unlimited life, and so long as someone owns the shares, that corporation goes on in existence. The 6th characteristic is owner liability. Here there's an advantage of the corporate form as well. The owner liability is limited, and it's limited to the amount of capital invested in the corporation. So if you've bought stocks worth $100,000, that's the amount of capital you've put into it. That's as much as you can lose. In a corporation, they cannot go after your personal assets if there was an issue of liability. Now, there's ways to what's called pierce the corporate veil, but by and large, if you are following the rules and running the business as a separate corporation, then there is separate and distinct owner liability of the person that owns the stock from the liability and obligations of the corporation itself. Let's talk about legal status. The best way to describe this is a corporation is a separate legal entity. It is separate and distinct from its owners. It is not one and the same. And let's talk a bit about the tax status. Now, here the corporate income tax is taxed, and its cash dividends are usually taxed at a 15% rate, sometimes a lower rate. But what we can say is there is corporate income tax. And then we can also say cash dividends are taxed usually at a lower 15% rate. Okay? And that takes care of the 8 characteristics provided in this exercise. Thanks, everyone.